Hi, welcome to episode 83 of Only Human. Today we're going to begin with our news story of the week. And this week it's a pretty bad headline. It says retired four-star Navy Admiral found guilty in bribery case. I'll come back to the story in just a minute. But over the past few years, there's been dozens, if not scores, of high-ranking military leaders that have been fired for cause. We talked about this a couple of weeks ago with a guest, and we talked about the leadership implications of that. And the private sector is not immune to this stuff either. Big businesses and small, we're finding less and less professionalism in our leaders. But our leaders come from a pool of workers, and our workers come from a pool of society. And I wonder how far down this stink of unprofessionalism goes. So today I want to talk about how we've lost the meaning of professionalism, why that matters, not only to people in government or people in business, but why it matters to all of us. Because once you've lost the meaning of something, the word is no longer of any value. And it's no surprise when we hear about things like this story of the four-star admiral found guilty in a bribery case. So let's begin with the story. I'll just read you the first couple of paragraphs I've got here down on my screen. It says, on Monday, the Navy's former number 2 officer was found guilty of bribery and other counts related to steering work to a company in exchange for a job after leaving the service, according to a statement from the U.S. Attorney's Office for the District of Columbia. Retired Admiral Robert Burke, former Navy Vice Chief of Naval Operations, was convicted of bribery and conspiracy to commit bribery, performing acts affecting his personal financial interest, and concealing material facts. His conviction makes him the most senior member of the U.S. military ever found guilty of committing a federal crime while serving on active duty. But he's not the only one. He may be the most senior. But we've seen a lot of this. And as I try to wrap my head around how somebody that could have achieved that rank either suddenly go off the rails or perhaps have hidden the fact that he was less than professional his entire way through the service, and then expanding that out right from the Navy to the private sector and into society in general. It brought me back to, I guess, what's my favorite Bible verse, which is James 3:16. Now, I know some of you guys out there are saying, wait a minute, man, he should have said John 3:16, right? Because that's the one everybody holds up on TV behind home plate in the baseball games. No, James 3:16. And I'll paraphrase it, but I think I've got it pretty close. He says, all the evil in the world comes from envy and greed. All the evil in the world comes from envy and greed. Pretty short verse. And it leads me into this idea of what's the counterbalance, right? Everybody wants more money, more power, more of whatever. Right? That's greed. Now, why do we want more? Because we see other people that have more. That's envy. So if envy and greed are ever present and everybody wants more as sort of a universal condition, what's the counterbalance to that? What keeps people inside the line? And if you believe a lot of folks out there that are professionals in safety or quality, even human resources types, they'll tell you it's the rules. Rules keep you inside the lines. Fear of getting caught breaking the rules. And only these people that are caught, they're a small percentage of most people who are compliant. Right? And so it really doesn't warrant a lot of investigation as long as we keep catching the perpetrators. You see, I don't buy that. I don't buy that at all. I think there's a natural law in play here. Do unto others as you would have done unto you. Right? Good versus evil. Our conscience, the better angels of our conscience at work on one side versus the greed and envy that's ever present in the world on the other side. But there has to be some ideology, right? There has to be some motivation that brings the better angels of our nature to the battle. I think there is. And I think it's the term professionalism. Professionalism has been something that's been on my radar screen for many, many years, at least 2 decades. And I've looked hard at it. And I know I've talked a lot about it, but I don't think I've talked about professionalism lost and found. So today I want to take you on a historical journey on what it meant to be a professional several hundred years ago, how that changed, and what it means to be a professional now, and hopefully how that's about to change again and what it means to be a professional in the future, which is going to look a lot like what professionalism used to be in the past. So let's go on that circular journey with me. So the first uttering that I could ever find of the word professional was in the 1420 Oxford English Dictionary. And it referred to a profession as someone who professed or vowed to follow the rules of the order, right? And back then there were 2 types of order, 2 types of organizations that required these vows. One was the church, right? You made a vow to the Lord and to the church that you would come in and follow their guidelines as you developed, right? The other were the trade guilds. And since the language in the trade guilds is a little easier to understand, and the language in the church depends on which monasteries and sect of the church you're in, we're going to use trade guilds. Okay? So let's talk for just a minute about how the trade guilds started. So you can go all the way back to caveman days when people were forming tribes, right? And in order to survive as a tribe, different types of work were segmented. Right? Some people were natural hunters. Other people were natural gatherers. Some people built weapons like arrows and bows and rakes and the tools. Right? Now, their capability in any one of these areas led to their stature within the tribe. Right? Somebody, for example, that could make a very straight arrow and attach the feathers as fletching and attach a stone or flint arrowhead to it that would fly straight. Now that person was really important. Okay? And it was important that person could pass along his skill set, his craftsmanship, big word there, onto others, but not too many. Because if everybody could build an arrow, he would lose his stature. So over time, these ideas that were passed from father to son or father to daughter or mother to son became much more codified. And I guess I'll use the example of the earliest days of glass blowing, just as an example. People that could make vases and pots and eventually panes of glass, but mostly vessels that held things. Extremely sophisticated work, right? And it requires some fairly sophisticated equipment. First of all, you've got to have all the raw materials, But then you also have to have a high temperature kiln that could melt that and begin to get the glass to be soft enough to be worked. So high temperature kilns meant lots of fire and bellows and fans to keep that fire hot. And so people that knew how to do this and do it well formed a guild, a trade guild. So now there was standards. For the very first time, it wasn't just, is the arrow straight? Can I kill a deer with it at 40 yards? It was, this is the way a vase, or if you prefer, a vase, is built. This is the width, the strength, right? This is the way that we make our kilns work without burning down the cities that are built of sticks and straw that are around us. Here's how many we should be able to produce per day. Here's what we should charge for them, right? So you can see that this began to have economic value as well as just tribal value. But in order to do this, there had to be some standards. And so they formed these guilds, and the guilds were formed up of several different levels. And here's where we go on professionalism. After the trade guilds were formed, if you wanted to be a glassblower, you didn't have to be a glassblower's son or daughter, right? All you had to do is at about age 12, say, I want to be a glassblower. And if they liked you, they'd bring you in as an apprentice. Right? And basically, you didn't learn how to blow glass. All you did was haul the materials. You did manual labor, right? You cleaned out the kilns. You hung around the area doing menial work for about 2 years until you learned the language of glass blowing and the dangers and just sort of the feel for the place. And during this time, as you were an apprentice, you were being evaluated all the time. And after a couple of years, sometimes a little less than that, sometimes a little bit more, you would be offered a chance to join as a novice, right? They used to call it novitiate. So as a novice, you actually began to learn how to do all of these things. Now, you're still probably helping out a little bit with the manual labor, but for the most part, you're watching a master work and you're learning the basic skills of the trade. Once again, you might spend 2 to 4 years as a novice. Now, if you started at 12, you become a novice at 14. Maybe by the time we would be graduating from high school, 17 or 18, you graduate from being a novice. You can now blow glass. You can now work to the standard. So you should be able to go out and earn a bunch of money, right? Not quite yet. The next step up the ladder, come in as an apprentice, then you become a novice. The next step up the ladder is journeyman. Journeyman, journeyman. The root word of journeyman is the French word jour, which means day. Right? Does that mean that these guys could only blow glass during the day? No. What it meant was a journeyman could only work within 1 day's travel from the master craftsman who had trained him or her. Mostly hymns back in the day. Why is that important? First of all, they can go out and sell vases, windows, whatever glass stuff they're building, and they can earn the money from that. Okay? But the guild has standards, and they don't want just anybody going out there and doing bad work. So now that you're making money, you're basically on probation. A journeyman is a probationary worker that goes out and does the work to standards, and if anything gets screwed up, the master craftsman comes in behind to fix it. And if the journeyman screws up too much, he may come back into being a novice where he doesn't get paid, or he may get kicked out of the guild altogether. Right? So there's some encouragement for the journeyman to do good work, but there's more. There's an economic reason he wants to climb to the next level. Because after you're a journeyman, your next level up is master craftsman. A master craftsman can grow a huge business because a master craftsman can supervise as many journeymen as he's produced. And he can also hire apprentices and train novices. A journeyman can do none of those things. So every journeyman wants to get to the level where he can become a master craftsman and really grow his business. So you got it, you're in at 14 or in at 12, into the novice rank, maybe around 14 or 15. Couple years there, 17, 18 years old, you become a journeyman. Depends on how good you are, how much experience you need, but you might be a journeyman for a decade before you're offered the opportunity to test for master craftsman. And then once you do that, even then you can fall backwards according to these guilds. So that was professionalism in the old days. It guaranteed quality work. It had multiple steps along the way, all of them assessed constantly. Okay? There was more money along the way, more opportunity along the way. And at the very end, the senior master craftsmen advanced their profession itself by new techniques and new designs, new ways of teaching and training. So the guilds really epitomized what early professionalism was. They produced professionals. And if you didn't make that cut, you were not part of their guild. Right? So what happened to that level of professionalism that was based on safety and customer service and craftsmanship and workmanship? Well, politics happened. Back at the, late part of the 19th century, probably late part of the 19th century, the guilds fell out of favor for a variety of reasons. But on both sides of the ocean, the professional guilds eventually were outlawed as monopolies, right? Hey, I can blow glass. I shouldn't have to go through this stupid little hierarchy of pain. Let's have a middle class here and let everybody do what they're capable of doing. Right? And the monarchs and the elected officials of the time heard the middle class and agreed. And they basically disbanded the guilds. Now, there are some guilds with the name guild, but nothing like what it used to be, right? Where you professed to meet standards and climb this hierarchy. So guess what happened when the guilds went away? Back to our glassblower example. Remember how I said, kilns can light things on fire and glass is dangerous and you should probably be careful with it? Well, shortly after the guilds dissolved, all kinds of safety issues occurred, all kinds of quality issues occurred. And the very same people that were, hollering for get rid of the elites and the guilds started saying, why are my cities burning down and my vases suck? What happened to the quality? And, well, what happened to it was the professionals went away. Now back to politics. You stay with me so far? First tribes learn how to do specialized work. Then they organize and they become guilds. They develop this hierarchy of professionalism. Then the government comes in and says, you guys can't be elite like that. We want to let everybody do everything. So you guys are disbanded. Now we've got all kinds of safety and quality problems. And how is the government going to solve that? And that's what I call the rise of the regulator. The earliest days of occupational health and safety and the Federal Aviation Administration and those types of things, government regulators. Before the government regulator, industries regulated themselves. And they regulated themselves to much higher standards than the government regulates us today. Okay? The only thing government regulators measure is public safety, occupational safety, and a certain minimum standard of compliance. Okay? There's no incentive to become a craftsman and a master craftsman. Okay? So during the rise of the government regulator, we saw professionalism drop from something that was once mentioned in 1420 as a vow to be a part of these guilds, to grow professionally over a career and get better and better in a safe way that satisfied the customers, that met the expectations of the level, to something the government comes in with a checklist and says, are you meeting minimum standards? And that's where we're at today. And we've been that way for a century or more. So what does that mean to us? Have we reached a point in time when we can never hope to go back to those days, those glory days of professionalism? No. All of those things, all of those standards are still available to any or all of us that has the willpower to seek them on their own. And that's why back in 2010 or so, after a wonderful opportunity with the National Transportation Safety Board to speak about professionalism, I began to research it and put together a model of what it used to look like. And then I updated it to 21st century standards and what it could look like today. A couple of books later, I wrote a book called Going Pro, The Deliberate Practice of Professionalism, and another one that's specifically for government workers who are in a special category of hell when it comes to minimum standards, called The Ghost of Nathan Hale. And each and every week, I have another input from somewhere or someone that says, have you considered adding this? Right. So right now, there's a lot of sub areas, and we'll get an opportunity to talk about them at some point, but professional ethics, which is got at least 7 sub areas to it, vocational excellence, professional engagement, continuous improvement, selflessness, mentoring, professional image. All of these are areas that were all present when the guilds were alive and well, that can be reclaimed by each and every one of us. So it might be a pipe dream that we can go back full circle to a place in time when we were developing intentionally, willfully, professionals that would pass that along in turn to the next generation. Professionalism is a word that's often used, but very, very seldom truly achieved, at least not in the historical sense that we've briefly discussed here today. But that can all change. And we may not change it all at once. We may not change it across the world or throughout the federal government, but we can change it in ourselves. And if we can build enough momentum to restore what true craftsmanship and workmanship, integrity of our product, service to our customers, all things that we can turn into habits, just like they did back in the 1700s and 1800s, then I think we're really onto something. And if we ever get to that point to where professionalism can be inculcated across the earliest days of someone's employment, right? Keep in mind, people came into the trade guilds when they were 12 to 14 years old. They began to be instructed in what it meant to be a professional from that very day. And that messaging never changed over the next 20 years. So we don't have that today. We don't have that consistency of training, education, knowledge. We don't have that consistency of quality control. We don't have that consistency of will, which is what it really needs to be. But if we can begin to build a cadre, beginning with ourselves, of people that truly see the advantage, the competitive advantage, to being a high-level professional, I like to say 6 foot tall in a 4 foot world, we can build a groundswell to move back to those days when things were better. The result, maybe I don't get something in the mail that has instructions for a completely different device than the one that I need to install. Maybe the parts on my refrigerator break less frequently. Maybe I don't have to make so many calls to customer service. Maybe I can see joy and passion in the man or woman behind the driver's license bureau desk when I go into work for the government. To me, that's what it's about. It's about reclaiming things that we left on the table long ago that are basically free. All we need to do is learn them, apply them daily, build them into habits, and we can turn this ship. And then perhaps we won't see Navy admirals and other military leaders and other civilian leaders falling for the darkness that James talks about in 3:16, envy and greed. Thanks for joining me here on episode 83. Like always, grow where you are with the resources at hand, and we'll see you again soon.